Welcome, everyone, to another episode of You Learn, You Turn. And once again, I have two rock star guests today. One of them is not a guest. She is actually part of our team at U Turn Health. Her name is Erin Crawl. And then we have Katherine Boyle with us today. And she is going to tell us about her background and what brings her here. But I am so excited to talk to these two young ladies today. Welcome to the show.
Thank
Thank
you so
you.
much.
So
Katherine, tell
excited.
us a little bit about your background and what brings you to a podcast like this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in Philadelphia. My dad was Philadelphia police. He was actually lieutenant of special victims for about as long as I can remember. One of my earliest memories is when he started in what was at the time sex crimes. Um,
Mm.
and I also grew up with surrounded by police officers. So almost all the men in my family were police officers. My cousin, when I was very young, I had a cousin who was killed in the line of duty. And yeah, so I grew up surrounded by them. I always was drawn to police officers, always supported them, always respected them, looked up to them. And in my adult life, I work in fashion full time. And in my adult life, I always wanted to kind of give back to these people who sacrifice so much for us. So I've spent a lot of time Googling how I can support police officers, and I come up short. I can't be a police officer. I don't have that in me. So I've always wanted to give back. And all Google would tell me is you can donate here, you can donate there. And so when 2020 happened and the riots were going on, I was living in New York City at the time, and it was really intense for me, really, really triggering for me. And during that time, I couldn't sleep because they were keeping me up. And I had sort of an aha moment where I needed to offer these people a safe community where they could come and share experiences and be themselves with people who understood what they were going through. So I started interviewing police officers, active and retired, to get a feel for what that could look like. And what kept coming up in those conversations was that my experience was unique, that I had a very active father. My dad was very involved in my life. I had nothing but positive experiences, and these officers that I was talking to kept telling me that their kids didn't have the same experience and they wish that they could say otherwise, but they couldn't. And so, you know, they kept expressing that they wish they had had some guidance so that they could have offered their kids something different. And so I thought, let me see if I can put my positive experience to good use and offer those resources and offer that insight to other people. Some people don't even recognize that it's happening. So starting a dialogue that your family might be affected by your job as a police officer. And so I'm just trying to start that conversation and that awareness and bring those people the proper resources so that they can have a well balanced and happy life at home and with their families.
That is fantastic, Katherine. Great job. I had one question to ask about your
Mhm.
father. First, is he still with us? Is he
He
still?
is,
Oh,
yeah,
good.
retired,
Awesome.
retired 14 years, I think, 13 years.
Wonderful. And when you say sex crimes, that sounds very intense. Is that sex trafficking? Just curious. Or is,
No, that's actually just what they called special victims here in Philadelphia. So it's actually divided into two sections here in Philly. So special victims is sex crimes such as sexual assault, rape,
oh
sex
gosh.
trafficking. And then
Yeah.
the other pillar is child abuse, at risk adults, things of that nature. And my dad oversaw both of them, but he was a little bit more specified in the children department.
That is tough. I mean, you have to be a special kind of person to do that, and not to bring that home would be amazing if he was able to do that, which it sounds like he
Mhm.
was. And so I want to dive into that. But Erin, we all know you. You've been on this podcast before, but for the new listeners, give us a little of your background and tell us about your dad.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's really pretty awesome is that Catherine and I have this shared experience as being the daughter of officers. But very different experiences. And I think that's what brought us here today, is just to kind of demonstrate that, you have this kind of persona as a a blue family member, but what does that mean? And it's different for everyone. And so I love the idea of bringing awareness to it. And my story, I
Mhm.
think, speaks a little bit to the what could happen. What do those repercussions look like? And so my dad was a Bridgeport, Connecticut police officer for about 36 years. He was just kind of on the brink of a 37th year. So he was like in the middle of those 2 years. Started when he was 21 years old. We have pictures of him as a little boy in a police uniform costume in Halloween.
Oh,
So he's definitely someone who wanted to be a police officer his whole life. Like, it was who he was. We are a very, very strong service oriented family. Fire, police, EMTs, military, teachers. I
wow.
mean, you name it, any kind of service industry. And so it's all I knew, just giving back to your community and loving your community. But we had such a sense of pride of being the family members of a police officer. I remember that vividly growing up, as being like, every picture I drew or every word I said about my dad was that he was a cop. Like, I was really excited about it. And so I often talk about kind of different chapters in my relationship with my dad, because it's the best way that I can kind of make sense of it. And so, just for kind of context, my dad did work in a various different kind of divisions within the department, and worked up the ranks. He was a captain when he ended up passing away on the job. Not from the job, but while he was still technically employed. And he worked in those different divisions, and it wasn't something that I knew a lot about as a kid. I didn't really know. If you asked me when I was 8, I couldn't tell you what division my dad was working in, right? But he did work on the night shift for a really good portion of my childhood. And so that's a vivid memory for me, is my dad. I always thought it was really normal for everyone's dad to like eat dinner and then go to work. And then they would see their parent walk, come through. When I was at the bus stop, I would wave to him, coming down the driveway. So there's bits and pieces that I remember that are positive, right? That I had that sense of pride. I loved seeing my dad kind of pull in the driveway after a shift when I was getting on the bus. And so there's a lot of pride, and there's a lot of good there. I think for me and my story, what happened was my dad was so fixated on protecting us from what he saw at work every day. And he, of course, saw traumatic and really, just tons of human suffering that he wouldn't want his daughters to see. And so I think he was so hyper focused on, how do I protect them from that, right? And then being also my mother, who is the daughter of a firefighter herself. So she knew what to expect to some kind of level. But how do you protect them from that, right? How do I not bring it home? And I'm a researcher by trade as well. I have a PhD in health communication, and a lot of what we do is we look at how to talk about really difficult topics. And one of the things that's often challenging in organizational contexts, and when we start to look at what we call ecological systems. So you're a part of these different systems, right? Your system is a family, your organization, society, etc. And so messages and your experiences kind of spill over. So we don't always have these like very strong boundaries that we think we do over work and life, right? We might want them, but oftentimes what happens is they spill over. So what goes on at work spills over to our family, and vice versa, right? If we're struggling at home, that's going to spill over into our work day too. So it's difficult, really, to kind of put those boundaries in place. I think what was lacking in my story and in my family's experience was the ability to talk about how to handle it, how to cope with that. So I talk about three versions of my dad very often, and I'll just give an overview here too, because it provides, again, some context to my story. My dad and I were super close growing up. Incredible human being, very engaged, and we were the typical kind of like father daughter that you would see in a movie, like typical daddy's girl, always wanted his attention, and it was wonderful. And as we kind of progress, as I'm getting older, he's taking more on at work. He's starting to work in different divisions, like I said, narcotics and vice. He worked undercover for a while on the night shift. I'm like 7, 8 years old. I'm young. And so he would come home, and he kind of just shifted to these different versions. It depended on the day, which made it very difficult for a child to really understand. You're not thinking in the back of your head, he has a really difficult job. He's seeing very traumatic things. That was never going on in my head. I knew he was Batman, is what I used to refer to him as, right? He fought the bad guys and he drove the Batmobile, but I didn't know the realities, and he didn't want me to know them. And so what ended up happening is there would be these different versions, and one of them was the engaged version, my typical wants to hang out, ask me about my homework, checking all those boxes, have fun in the backyard, etc. And then there was what I call the easily irritated or angry version. So there could be like, I leave my shoes at the door and didn't put them away, or didn't do a chore, which is like something really small that he would never get mad at, but that day he would get mad, and it would be a trigger for being annoyed for the whole evening. And the last one is probably the hardest one for me, and it's something that a really well-known name in this field, Dr. Gil Martin, talks a lot about this kind of this concept of being home but not really present, and not really being
Mhm.
engaged. And so I often call it the ghost version. And this is where he would come home, you're excited. Your parent gets home, you want to tell them about your day, and he would walk right by. No hi, how was your day? No, nothing. And then would maybe sit in his recliner chair for the rest of the evening, not really engage with the family, doesn't really talk to us, and then goes to bed. So now years of this over time, right? It's the which version is coming home, right? It's the
Mhm.
walking on eggshells. You're not really sure what kind of day he had at work. So I don't know. Is he in a good mood today? A bad mood? Is he going to ignore me? Will he say hi? I took it personal when I was ignored. I'm a little kid. I don't know any better. And so all of that kind of built up into a pretty resentful teenager, to be honest with you. By the time that he was on the day shift and a captain, he was working a pretty typical 9 to 5. He had a lot more time to spend, but to be really honest with you, I was resentful at that point. It's mom was running the show for this many years and she was in charge, and you haven't really been around that much. And when you were, you weren't really totally engaged. So there was a lot of resentment there. You're also a teenager and nothing is great in those years anyway, right? So it's just this added layer of like now your dad wants to be involved. And so, I kind of say that jokingly, but it was really difficult for us. And unfortunately, he got diagnosed with a very aggressive form of cancer when I was 20 years old, and he died in 6 months. So we didn't really ever have the opportunity to talk about things. And so kind of my passion and where I come from in this conversation is I think it's so important to really kind of just take the time to learn how to have these difficult conversations. It's not easy. My parents did the very best they could with what they had. The tools that were in their toolbox, they tried. They're great human beings, but our family struggled. It wasn't easy, and we didn't talk about things that we should have talked about. And I think at the same time, my father never got to have retirement. He retired in hospice care and he died the next day. And so he never got to
Mm.
really have that time where it was just about him. So he literally gave his life to his career. And like I said, I think it's all about they didn't have the tools in their toolbox. And I'm so glad we're having these conversations. And I'm so glad to meet people like Katherine who, did have a different experience and is so motivated and passionate about making sure that families that come after us will have those tools because it is so important.
Erin, thank you so much for being so transparent and honest about all your feelings. And I can only imagine what your dad saw at work. And you said it. You nailed it. He didn't have the tools. It wasn't that he didn't love you. It wasn't that he didn't care. But he literally had no idea and thought that he was protecting you by going and sitting in his lounger rather than telling you what he saw. And I think we're trying to get at what exactly you needed. But I really want Catherine to share her experience growing up in the home of a police officer because it sounds like the two are very different.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Aaron, thank you for sharing. One thing I will say that actually stands out to me listening to Aaron is my dad became a cop when he was 30 or 31. He became a cop because he needed a job. He had gone to school. This is part two. He had gone to school for psychology. So he had a degree in the mental health field, got a job in that field, working with people with mental disabilities. And at this time, the institutions were closing down, and he was out of a job really quickly and needed one really badly. So his older brother was a cop, and they had good benefits. So he said, "Sign me up. I'll just do this." And I think because of that, he had a degree in mental health. And at that time, as a police officer, that was pretty unique. Um, B, he had a very well established idea of who he was, the life he wanted to live, the family that he wanted to raise eventually. Um, and so he had a very strong identity. And C, he went into it, with a different mindset. This is my job. I need to do this because I need to put food on my table for my kids and my family. Um, so I think that those things really served him and us as a result. And yeah, my experience was different. I remember, and to be completely transparent, I don't know what it was like for my siblings. It's not something that we've really talked about. But for me, it was, dad was very involved. We were very excited when he would come home. My brother and I even talk about this now. Like when he would come through the door, we knew what time he would be home. We'd be done our homework, whatever. We would greet him at the door, and our routine was to punch him in the stomach because he had this big beer belly, which I think Dr. Gilmartin talks about in Emotional Survival also. And we would punch him in the stomach because we got a kick out of this beer belly that he had. And that was just kind of the way we welcomed him home. Then he would go put on what we called his play clothes, which was t-shirt and jeans, and he would come down and we would play in the dining room turned playroom while my mom made dinner. And I always joke because I feel like we had a very beaver cleaver upbringing. Like mom's making dinner and dad's playing with the kids, and it's cute and it's silly and it's funny. And I'm very blessed and I'm very grateful that that is my experience. But the reality is that it's not everybody's. And my parents were very intentional in everything that they did. So I talk about, when it came to finances, my dad never wanted to have to work overtime. He never wanted to be taken away from us more than he needed to be. So my mom wanted to be a stay-at-home mom. My dad didn't want to take on overtime. So they spent a lot of time, you know, crunching the numbers, clipping the coupons, whatever they needed to do to afford the lifestyle that they wanted while also having the individual lifestyles they wanted. So my mom stay at home mom, my dad not taking on overtime. And then two, there were just a lot of daily habits that my dad put into place. So, if he was coming home early in the morning after night shift, he would be the one to wake us up for school. So he would see us and then he would go to bed and my mom would kind of take over. Maybe he would come home later at night and come and read us our bedtime story before going to sleep or doing whatever he was going to do. So he would really go out of his way to make sure that we would at least have some FaceTime with him. And it wasn't always leaps and bounds, or jumping through hoops to be with us and spend a lot of time with us, but it was small things that as children really stood out and really made a big difference. Um, I actually was joking with my mom recently because there was this period when he was going through some sort of promotion and he had to be put on night work for, I think it was like 6 months. I don't even know if it was that long. But I mentioned it to my mom fairly recently and I was like, "Remember when dad wasn't home for dinner like ever?" And she was like, "Kate," they call me Kate. "Kate, that was like 6 months out of your life. Like settle down." But that goes to show that as a child, those things make such a big difference. Like it was a very short period of time, but to me in my little child brain, I was impacted hugely by the fact that he missed a couple dinners. So, yeah, I
Yeah.
think it came back a lot to the intentionality that he
Mhm.
put into being there for us.
And it sounds like the background that he had in mental health
Hmm.
helped him tremendously. Whereas,
Yeah.
you know, Aaron, your father was a police officer at 21. You
Hmm.
know,
21.
I mean, how old are you now? So think about that. Think about his brain. Think about
Hmm.
I mean, that was his identity. I mean, because when he
Hmm.
became a man, he was a
Hmm.
police officer and he knew nothing else. And there's nothing wrong with either one. It's
Hmm.
just a completely different scenario. But having said that, I know that there's some challenges, Catherine, besides the missing dinner. I know, Aaron, that you wanted to touch on a couple of challenges that, having a first responder parent brings. And then tell me a little bit about how you coped with it, because now I know that you're making it so police officer families do not have to suffer. So what were some of the challenges that you came across first, Aaron, and then Catherine, if you can think of any? It does sound like you had sort of a, I'm a little jealous of your family life too, because I certainly did not. My dad worked in finance, but I didn't see him ever for dinner. So
We're all going to the Boyles' house for dinner.
I know, right?
Come on over.
Aaron, what do you think your biggest challenge was besides being the ghost dad that you talked about?
Absolutely. So I think I can talk to a few of them. I think the first and foremost is this engagement factor, right? You have this intense job. It is exhausting on so many levels. We don't often talk about the fact that they're dealing with different types of stressors all at once. It's not just what people might think of as, responding to a car accident or responding to, a child death. I mean, those are extremely traumatic things. But on top of it, they're also dealing with organizational stress, which actually the literature shows us is equally, if not more sometimes, of an impact on mental well-being of officers. And then they're also dealing with normal life stress, right? Like I grew up with a police officer and a teacher as a mom, and I often, would kind of joke with them. They're two people that, those two different professions, no one thinks that they have a real life, right? Teachers are to be in school. If we ever bumped into
Yeah.
a student of my mom's at like Target, they'd be like, "What are you doing out of the school? Like, I didn't know," And then my dad was a police officer. So these are like two professions that you don't often think about the family behind them, right? You just kind of think of them as those are their professions, those are their identities, right? So they have various different layers, if you will, of stress. It's not just this one stressor. And so, you know, how do you cope with different types of stressors? It's not going to be the same for everyone. And it's also not going to mean that you're only dealing with one type at one time. And I think that's so critical to understand, because now you're dealing with, I have stress at work, I have stress with leadership or with whatever organizational, nonsense might be going on. And then you also have your stress at home, right? And so if you picture, and I'm laughing even about to say this, I grew up in chaos. So if I had to describe my childhood in one word, chaos, for better or worse. I had a great childhood in many ways. My parents, like I said, I can't speak more highly of them. They were fantastic human beings my whole life. But it was pure chaos. I won't lie to you. I'll be really real here. It was chaotic. And I actually married into more of a Boyle family type of format. And so my husband's often like, "You're a tornado." I'm like, "I come from tornadoes." And so I think, the reason I mentioned that is because I think what's really hard is transitioning home. So now you have a whole new environment with its own stress, right? My mom's coming home. She worked a full day. I have a sister, so there's two of us. She's trying to get whatever, cooking, going, asking my dad some questions because he's been, gone maybe that whole day and night. They were kind of like passing ships a lot, because he's working the night shift, and she has to get up early with us. So there was just a lot of chaos. And I think to come from an environment where you are in control of the scene, right? That's a first responder's job, is to take control of the scene and to help people. And you're the constant point of leadership on those scenes, right? And so now when you come home, I think my dad often, kind of reflecting back, and I've had so many conversations with my mother since my dad has passed about this, because we didn't talk about it as a family and we were really open to it now. He just didn't want to make more decisions. I think he was overwhelmed by his day. And so to come home and to be bombarded, not on purpose, but, I want his attention. My sister wants his attention. My mother has questions. She's married. She wants his attention in some capacity too, right? So I think that's a lot. So I would say transitioning home probably is a challenge that I observed as a family member. And I would say that's a challenge for the family members too, because you want them home. You want to talk about, them, and you want to hear from them. And that lack of engagement that comes with not transitioning well can be really detrimental to the family members. And, when I say the ghost version, um, that was really hard. It was really hard not to understand why my dad didn't want to come sit at the table, or if he did sit at the table, why he's silent. Like, why is my dad not talking? Or why, if we go to a family party after he worked a full weekend shift, why is he in the corner? Why is he not
Mhm.
talking to anyone? Right? Like, it just didn't add up for me. And I always felt like, as I got older, like, why is he always so annoyed? Or like, why is he so cynical? I always thought he was like the most cynical person on earth. And you're like a naive little kid too. So you think the world is just this magical place. And so I'm just thinking like, what is wrong constantly? And so that was really hard for me, that engagement piece. And I think a lot of it comes from that transition home. When
Mhm.
Katherine, you were talking about kind of putting on your play clothes, that's something I talk a lot about with spouses in a recent research study is what's the routine when you come home that helps you transition, right? A lot of spouses talk about taking 30 minutes in the driveway before you even walk in the door.
Mm.
If you need those 30 minutes to just kind of regroup so that when you do get bombarded with the highs and the questions, that you feel like you're a little bit more equipped. So I think the biggest challenge for us is definitely that transitioning, right? You're going from super hyper vigilant state, you're so alert, you're so aware, to now coming down to being with your family. And I think the other piece of it, and they really go hand in hand, is that engagement, right? Are you physically present and engaged, or are you just physically present? And there's a difference there, and that can be really challenging for the family.
It almost sounds like it would be better if he didn't come home and he was still on the job and you didn't see him at all than have him home and not be present. Um, to me, the sign of indifference is, especially to a child, is more hurtful than not having them there at all.
It's so
Um,
interesting that you mentioned that, because there is when I was doing my dissertation research, there is a department in California, in Northern California, where they do you 3 or 4 on, but they stay almost like on campus, so to speak. They live there, like firefighters would stay over, and then they come home and they have their 3 or 4 off, and they love it. It sounds like it's something they wouldn't love, but they literally, for what you just explained to me, Liz, that's why they like it so much. They said, when I'm home, I'm home. And when
yep.
I go to work, I'm at work.
Right.
My dad every night has to come home, or if he was working the night shift, come home every morning. He's not sleeping. I mean, no one on the night shift is getting good sleep. It's really difficult. And when you have kids who are, we're not staying, we are not staying quiet. So now your health and your well-being are just off. And then on top of it, you're anticipating your next day of work, right? So you're home for this very short time, and you're probably thinking about the next day at work. What am I going to see
Yeah.
again, right? What a traumatic experience. So you're not really in home mode, if you will, right? Like, you're not really totally transitioned, because you've got to get up and do it again very shortly after. So I think it's a very interesting comment, Liz. I'm curious if we see more of that, and what the outcomes would be of that.
When you're on, you're on. When you're off, you're off, just like the military. Um,
Exactly.
so it doesn't sound like you had any challenges with your dad being a police officer. Did you ever see? I'm interested to hear if you ever saw him doing anything like she was saying, sitting in the car for a period of time. Did you ever see him decompressing in a way that was healthy? Um, any of that? Can you bring how it would look differently from Aaron's?
So, yeah, I think one thing my dad had built in was a 40-minute commute home. So I think that he
Ah,
probably, decompressed on his drive home, whether he
sure.
even realized it or not. We didn't live near where his department was, so he had a long drive home, whether he liked it or not, and that's going to help his nervous system and his brain and everything sort of shift and recognize, okay, I'm doing this drive and this means that my next step is to welcome my kids at the door, and so on and so forth. And I think that that really worked in his favor. Another thing that he did, and again, whether he realized it or not, I think was really good for his mental health and overall well-being, is when we got a little bit older, we got an above ground pool in our backyard, and that pool became his baby. Like, every day. Again, we're a little bit older at this point, so we're not punching him in the stomach anymore. We're out playing with our friends. Every day he would come home, get in his play clothes, and clean the pool. And then after he cleaned the pool, he would get on his float and like float in the pool and nap in the pool for quite some time sometimes. And I think that that was, again, whether he realized it or not, that was some sort of routine, Erin, back to your
Hmm.
point. That was a routine. Come home, get comfortable, clean the pool, relax. And again, whether he realized it or not, some form of meditation while he's lying there reflecting on whatever it was that was going through his mind, even if it was just blanking out because he was napping, but it was still working towards his benefit.
Um, so Erin, you've told me that you were, I would love for our listeners, because I'm picturing families listening right now going, well, this is what happens in our house. What besides you being not a resistant teen, what did you say you were? You were
What did I say? Cranky? You could use
no,
that
not
word.
cranky,
Resentful.
Oh,
resentful.
resentful,
You are a
resentful.
resentful
Yeah.
teen.
Hmm.
Besides that, did you see it affecting your sister, your mom, any of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, similar to Catherine, I've never had a conversation about it with my sister to believe if you can believe that or not. I think for me, we definitely had different, very, very starkly different personalities. I will tell you this, I am someone who is extremely sensitive human being. And
Hmm.
so if I feel something, I feel it deep. If I, for better or worse, if I'm excited, I am like, Tigger. I'm so excited. And if I am sad, I'm like, very sad. So for me, I took it very personal when my dad, when that was that phase of the ghost version. That was
Yeah,
very personal for me because what I didn't really explain is it could be like the day before we were laughing about something or excited about soccer or, whatever. We bonded over sports quite a bit. I was an athlete growing up and he loved sports. And so it would literally be the next shift that he would come home from and then nothing. So to me,
yeah.
I'm like, what the heck happened? Like what, I'm young. So I'm like, what went wrong? What did I do? So I internalized a lot of it. And I blamed myself. And I think it's because I was someone who felt everything so deep. And so I think my sister had a very different experience and perspective. I will say I have had conversations with my mother,
Hmm.
um, pretty extensive ones since my dad has passed away. And a lot of what she says is it was really hard for her because she was playing both of these roles, right? She was a mom and she was also a spouse. She was understanding that my dad was struggling and he couldn't talk about it and didn't know how to talk about it, but he also or she, excuse me, was also watching me get resentful and that was killing her, right? It was killing her. This is her, the love of her life, her spouse, her partner, her best friend, and she didn't know how to bridge this gap. And I think that really killed her. I think that was really, really difficult. And so that's something that she talks about now is she always says, I really wish I did better. And I just look at her and say, you didn't have the tools. You didn't have it. No one was teaching you that. You didn't get handed a handbook when you married, my father. How would you know? And so I think my mom's perspective from what she's told me is that she felt so conflicted in this dual role of I want to support my husband. I know that he's struggling and I know it's too hard to talk about and that we don't know how to talk about it with our kids. But I also see my kid becoming resentful and upset and our relationship was kind of pulling apart. So I think that was kind of the other perspectives that I've seen in the household for sure.
Well, this brings us to a very important part of the talk today. And I really want to know, because we're all about a solution, from each of you guys' perspective, what is needed moving forward to help families navigate through this? What can we do differently? Um, and Catherine, you obviously, even though your family got along pretty okay, by seeing firsthand with the riots and all the stuff that you were talking about earlier, that this is a problem. And Erin, this is your job. So let's tell America what you guys are dishing out for help, because it's good. You want to start with Catherine?
Okay, yeah. I think so. First and foremost, having these conversations because I feel like
Hmm.
it's not talked about and it's just assumed. Actually, back to the point that you guys were making before, policing is seemingly a 9 to 5 job. That's how 90% of America sees it. You go out to work and come home at the end of the day. So it's no different than, anyone else, but it's so different. And my husband is military, and so it's so understood and recognized that when someone goes off to war, they're going to come back and they might need some extra support, and they might need some mental health resources. And we understand the effects to a degree, that they might, of what they may have experienced. But with police officers, they're seeing horrific things in their own backyard. And so few people understand it or recognize it or are willing to talk about it. So I really think just having the conversations is absolutely the first step. And then beyond that, offering the resources, building the resources, because a lot of them don't even exist. So, I feel very strongly about bringing together these police officers who want to have a relationship with their kids. They don't want to get to retirement and not know who their kids are, or not have an opportunity to spend that time with their children, or have a relationship with them. I want to start the conversation so that they can see that there might be a problem at foot, and then bring them together so that they can come up with a solution. They can learn from people who have been through it and navigated it positively, like my dad, or people who have been through it and learned the hard way, which unfortunately is quite common. And I really want to bring them together so that they can learn these tools and these resources and be there for one another. Because the other thing that I feel so strongly about is this idea of, again, identifying as the job, feeling as though these men and women in blue are the only people who understand you, and they're the only people that you can spend quality time with, or going out for choir practice after work, things of that nature that are just not doing the individual any positive anything. So really, here's this group of other men and women who understand what you're going through, but they've got these priorities and values that align with yours, and you guys can spend time together and be there for one another and have healthy outlets. And so that's really what I want to do. I want to host events that will allow them to get to know one another, and just bring them together and give them that platform that they can know that it is possible, that they don't need to wait until they've retired or wait until it's too late to have a relationship with their kids.
Or that sadly, suicide is so high in the first responder community, because they often, the stigma, and that's what we do at U-Turn Health, is we have the conversations because they've become normalized. And I know that I've talked to Erin about this before, for a police officer or a first responder at all to say, I'm having a bad day, they get a lot of heat, or they used to. It's becoming better, but from other officers or from their higher ups, well, suck it up. This is the job you signed up for. So oftentimes the talk does not happen because of stigma. So I think that's great what you said: resources, community more than anything. If we could all rally around the first responder community and help them, and to meet each other and talk about their struggles openly, just like I do with my recovery meetings. I mean, why not have not recovery meetings, but meetings for first responders where they can share what they're going through? So excellent points. I think you're definitely on the right track, and thank you so much for all you're doing. And Erin, tell us how you see this happening in the police officers, but first responder world, all around, to support these guys and their families.
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing for me, and this is really truly an extension of a lot of what Katherine said, I think we're very much on the same page on this, but I think a lot of people, and not just first responders, but a lot of people feel as though mental health related conversations have to be this like ginormous, very intense kind of conversation, right? We were like, oh God, we can't talk about that. Like we don't know how to do that. But it really comes down to support when we're thinking family, right? So, and what I mean by that is really the first is just to understand that there's various different types of support. So, if you maybe it's not emotional support that you need in that moment, maybe it's more informational, maybe it's I know about these resources. I did some research. I know that we're struggling right now with X, Y, or Z, and so here are some things that I found. And maybe it's tangible. Maybe it's, hey, I know that you had a long day today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the kids for a walk so you can have 20 minutes in here by yourself, just relax. You know what I mean? So there's different types of support. So I think one of the things that we have to kind of do and maybe help other people really understand is it doesn't always have to be every single time this very emotional, deep conversation that we're having. It can be as easy as, and I don't mean to use the word easy, I really shouldn't even use that word because it is still difficult, but it's as simple as, what do you need for support today? What do you need for support in this moment? If you see your spouse coming home, if you see your dad or whomever is a first responder coming through that door and they look like they need help in some way, maybe they don't know how to talk about it. Maybe you don't know how to talk about it, but can you just say, what do you need for support today? What's something
Mhm.
that I can do to help support you? And just open the conversation that way. And I know that sometimes that sounds like, oh, yeah, I can do that. It is still hard, right? It is
Mhm.
still, how do I remember to do that? And in the midst of chaos, when there's homework and there's food and all these things that have to get checked off. And so finding a way to make it authentic as part of your relationship. But I think it's so critical to have open conversations, not just for supporting the first responder, but vice versa. I
Mhm.
think a lot of the stress that my dad often had was felt guilty about coming home and not being present, or he felt guilty that, unlike Catherine, she said her dad didn't take that much overtime. My dad worked a lot of overtime, a lot of overtime. And so he felt guilty, right? He wanted to be this engaged dad. And I think he felt really torn
Yeah.
between that passion for both and really identifying with being a cop before he was anything else. And so I think to kind of mitigate some of that, right? Because that causes stress too, and you feel that sense of guilt. So to mitigate some of that, I think it just goes down to really sitting and taking a minute and saying, here's what I need for support today. What do you need for support? And just matching those up. And I don't think that we're ever going to get to a point where police officers are going home and telling their kids about the graphic things they've seen. Just not going to happen, right? And
No,
I never
no.
mean to say, when I talk about how my dad didn't talk about it, I never mean I wish he told me about those traumatic scenes, right? But I think what happens is it's 0 to 100, right? People think like, well, I'm either going to say nothing or
Yeah.
I can't tell them these details, right? And so how do we find an in between? And I think it starts with, I had a really challenging day at work today, which means that, I had to help people who were struggling, or, those types of things. Really unpacking that in a way that makes sense for a kid too, right? And I always tell my mom we have to write a children's book for this to really help children understand. But I think kids want to be in the know, right? As you're growing up, you are so observant when you were young and you
Mhm.
notice everything and you idolize your parents, hopefully, right? I was lucky enough to idolize both of my parents. So I noticed everything. And so I think
Mhm.
just to really summarize, I think it's asking for what type of support that you want and need, but also making sure that you check in with your significant other to make sure they feel that too, right? Which is going to help you in turn feel like I'm a part of this. And so recognizing that they're going to need support from you, and then having those conversations with your kids, finding ways to infuse it in the conversation that makes sense for you, and not feeling so overwhelmed that like I can't talk about it for not one single word. And then dedicating some quality time too, I think is really important. If we're focusing just on how to really enhance the family part, I feel like those different components are going to really strengthen the the experience for everyone involved. And so I think that's really one step forward. And I think, you know, going back to Catherine's point, it's all about support and services, but they have to be utilized. So if we
Yeah.
have things that are offered and first responders don't want to use them, they're not doing what they should be doing, right? So and so what I think, and this is something I feel so incredibly passionate about, and I'll wrap up with this, is they have to be part of the solution. So we can't possibly move forward and say, these are the things and these are the types of support that we're going to provide. And, people like ourselves who really care and want to provide really helpful things, they have to be part of it. So I think research is another really critical component. Sitting down and asking questions from first responders and their family members, what do you want and need? I don't think we know enough. I don't think we have these conversations regularly to the point where we really have a strong understanding for what's needed. So I think we need to continue that conversation, and we need to do it in a way that puts their wants and their needs and their preferences in the forefront and develop services and resources based on what they tell us, because that's the bottom line. We need them to use them. And so it has to be aligned with what they want.
That is wonderful. While you were talking about you and your mom writing a book, I think that would be phenomenal for kids because they would be able to understand dad's had a bad day because of his job. It has nothing to do with you, and
Right.
almost make it part of the training curriculum for the police officer to give his family these resources with your book
Mhm.
and all the videos that y'all are going to create for the kids. You know, I'm sure they have them for people in the military, or maybe they have them for doctors. You know, your dad or your mom is gone for this amount of time because this is their job, and it has nothing, you know, just explaining to the kids. And I think you're right about asking them what they need, because we can't just keep throwing stuff at them that just sits on a shelf, which
Right.
is what I heard
Mhm.
is happening. Well, I want to finish with just saying that you girls are amazing, and the fact that you've put your passion into action and that you're doing something about it. And lovely to meet you, Catherine. Would y'all like to wrap up with any final statements of first responders or police officers or anything?
Go first. You can go first, Katherine.
Um, yeah, I would just say, you know, honestly, if it's a first responder, you know, listening, just know that your family needs you and they want you
Mm,
there, and your involvement doesn't need to be, you know, you don't need to make massive gestures. Like I said in the beginning, to children, a little gesture goes a really long way. An extra 10-minute chat in the car on your way to soccer practice or school or whatever it is going to go a long way and have a huge impact on them. And I would be willing to bet that you, as a first responder, would not want to get to retirement or the end of your career. God willing, it is retirement, and not have that relationship. So just take a second to have that forethought of what's to come and the future that your child is going to have, and what sorts of memories you want to build for them and afford them, because it's going to make a huge difference in who they become. And at the end of the day, it'll also make you a better police officer. If you have that in place at home, you can show up so much better for your job.
I love
Aaron?
that. Yeah, absolutely. I would just add on to that. I often think, if I did have another year with my dad or even another day, right? We didn't talk
Yeah.
about this before he passed away. And I often think of what I would say. And one of the things that always comes to mind is, I didn't love you because you were a cop. I didn't love you because you
Mm,
were Batman to me. I loved you because you were my dad, right? And so I think a lot of the times, especially from a family perspective, they want their family to be so proud of them, right? And we were. And it wasn't because he was a police officer. We had so much pride in that, but it
hmm
was because he was my dad and I loved him for him. And so I think that message can often get convoluted in the fact that they have this persona to uphold, right? We do that in society. We put them um as these invincible human beings. And so I think it was really hard that he didn't want to let the family down either to be struggling. So I think, my biggest takeaway, my biggest comment as someone who didn't get that time with my dad after retirement and who, we did struggle and didn't have those conversations. That's something that I hope that people that are listening can really take to heart and really grasp is your kids do not love you because you're a police officer. They are prideful and they adore you, but it's not because of that. It's because of who you are as a person beyond that badge. And if my dad was never a cop, I'd still love him the same. So I think that that's a huge takeaway is to really help get that mindset going, because I know it has to be so difficult to not get wrapped into that identity factor and feeling like I have to be perfect in all capacities because I'm a cop.
I
that's
have
great.
one more to add,
Yeah,
if I
yeah.
could. If you're listening and you are in a leadership position, I think that it's really important for you to lead from the front in that sense, and let your people know that it's okay to seek the help that they need, to take the time that they need,
Yeah.
and lead by example and do those things. Seek that help for yourself, the support for yourself, be there for your family, and just, my dad was an adult, an established adult when he became a police officer, and he tried to sort of import his wisdom and knowledge on the younger cops coming in.
I love that.
And it's just such an important element, as someone in a leadership position, to sort of set that precedence. So make sure you're making it okay for your people.
I think that's
And maybe
great, Catherine. Yeah,
that
that
is great.
authenticity factor, right? It goes back
Mhm.
to, if you say take care of your health and well-being and we care about that and it's important and you should prioritize it, and then They work constant overtime. They don't take care of themselves. They don't seek support. They don't seek
Right.
help. It goes back to role modeling, right? I mean, if you don't
Yeah.
see that being modeled for you, it's just a message at that point. It doesn't have the substance that it really needs. So I think that's a great kind of wrap up too.
Well, you ladies are smart, and I have no doubt that you will continue to make waves in the space and help so many people. And I'm glad to know you both. And thanks everyone for listening today to You Learn, You Turn. And I will have more information on these lovely ladies on our show notes. So join us back next time for You Learn, You Turn. Bye.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.